Welcome back. And now we're going to discuss the fight against Boko Haram. For more than 10 years, the Islamist movement has terrorized Nigeria and Nigerians, and it seems that with every passing year, they intensify their activities. Last week, we heard that there were negotiations between the federal government and the sect, and that central to that was the release of the Chibok girls. Of course, up until now, we have had no feedback as to what has happened. Even though a ceasefire was declared last week, the very night of the announcement of the ceasefire, we heard that there were attacks again in certain parts of the north. Now, to look at this fight with us this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome Pastor Ladi Thompson, who is a security expert. Good morning, Pastor.
The pleasure is mine.
For coming.
Yeah.
I think it would be very apt for us to start at the point of the truce declared last week and happenings between then and now. What are your thoughts about that ceasefire agreement and the attacks that ensued? Some have said that Boko Haram now has factions. What are your thoughts?
Well, when I first heard about this so-called truce that was going to be put into place, I was alarmed. I was alarmed because it was coming from what seemed like official channels from the federal government. I was alarmed because it would be a pointer that indeed of a truth, it will become clear to the whole nation and to the nations of the world that the federal government of Nigeria does not have any cohesive policy and has really lost the plot in its war against terror in Nigeria. I say this because if you ignore the ideological aspect of what the Boko Haram generic, what it represents, that is the only time when you would allow anybody to deceive you that there would ever be a so-called cessation of violence for a season that would not be strategically advantageous to the Boko Haram. So I even thought it was a joke until the American president began to talk about us honoring this so-called ceasefire. And there and then I knew that this country is in trouble. We're in trouble because everywhere else they have this problem. They describe it as a resurgence of Islamism, terrorism. But Nigerians have not noticed that the global press, and indeed the local press as well, is addressing the Nigerian problem as an insurgency. An insurgency is an uprising. Now, the Nigerian government, in agreeing to a ceasefire, has even demonstrated to the rest of the globe that it does not have a terrorism problem. That what it has is an insurgency problem, which is something that's completely different from what we're dealing with here.
So what you're saying is that we're dealing with terrorism?
Absolutely.
Are you insinuating that the negotiations should not have been entered into at all?
Now, this is what I want to point out. There are a lot of moves. Nigeria's security services have been infiltrated. It is obvious from the international perspective when you see everything that has happened concerning this, the handling of terrorism, that Nigeria lacks a coherent policy. Nigeria doesn't seem to have an understanding of what it is even handling in the first place. So what we're looking at is the fact that how do you tell a people who have an ideology, who have a global backing, who have a set objective, and who have a history that you can study to see that they never really negotiate with anybody or stop in their pursuit except they are defeated or they defeat the host country? How on earth do you go to them to negotiate? Now, I think it's a political thing, and that's what makes me cry. I think elder statesmen and people who have more vision, who have an idea, who want a future for our children in this country, need to step in quickly to make sure we don't politicize this issue. I'll give you an example. Remember the Chibok girls who escaped from Sambisa Forest that we brought to Lagos with their mothers to have what we call rehabilitation, for us to like debrief them, to give them medical attention and all that, just to set the pattern for this country on how to handle some of these things. What we never mentioned before, and what I'm going to mention now, is that after that, we've also had some, I've been involved in rehabilitating some of the girls who have been released periodically by the Boko Haram without all this political noise. The Nigerian army is aware of this. Now, I recall that one of the girls who was released, when she got into our hands and we were going to treat her, I remember that I saw her countenance, listened to her speech pattern, and I said to the people around us that, look, pay attention to this girl. She has been traumatized much more than the others. She had spent 6 months in Sambisa forest. Now, the bottom line is this.
Oh, she wasn't among the Chibok girls?
Not among. Prior to the Chibok, she had been captured. And then she had been released. Because unofficially, quietly, there's been a lot of these girls who have been released, not necessarily the Chibok girls. But I want to use this particular girl's example for us to know what we're dealing with here. Now, this girl, when we began to talk to her and debrief her, said no, they had not violated her, and they were so nice, and they were just fetching water in Sambisa forest and all that. As I listened, I signaled the experts. They carried out tests the next day, and while we will never mention the name of this girl, and while we will never compromise her identity, I must mention that this girl was not only pregnant, but she was HIV positive.
Oh dear.
So how thoughtless can a country become when we begin to politicize issues like this and talk about a ceasefire to release the Chibok girls when we have not allowed the nation to know the depth and the extent to which things have worsened, as it were, in the battlefronts? So what are we asking for right now? Are we saying that when we get these girls back, if they are all HIV positive, then we are going to be rejoicing? If these girls have been violated, I mean, girls who left home as young innocent girls, who are going to be returned like broken vessels, why are we not a bit more empathic? Why are we not a bit more structured in our approach to this war that is being conducted on our grounds?
Let me pick up something very quickly. Actually, let's introduce Mr. Ekhomu, who has since joined us, a security expert as well. I'll come back to you. Probably have heard with the line of conversation, but let me just ask Pastor. What you're saying in essence is we're not facing an insurgency. That is a misnomer.
Yes.
And if it is a misnomer, it means that we're following a wrong path.
Completely.
In terms of our approach to dealing with the issue.
Without a shadow of doubt.
So at what point do we begin to say that we've